Good morning. Today's sermon comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 12, verses 1 through 7. John, chapter 12, verses 1 through 7. I'll read it now. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus has raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used it to help himself and was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you will always have with you, but you do not always have me." This is the word of the Lord. This is one of the strangest and most surprising moments in the gospel. Jesus and his disciples are at a dinner party, and they are celebrating Lazarus' return to life, the miracle. The greatest miracle so far. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus are siblings, and Lazarus is at the table eating with Jesus and the disciples. Mary is serving the food, and then Mary does something really weird. She gets a jar of very expensive perfume and pours it on the feet of Jesus. Not a little, but a lot. So much perfume that the entire room smells of it. And then she wipes his feet with her hair. Now, this perfume is worth 300 denarii. That's a year's wage. Imagine your entire year's wage and spending it all on perfume, CK1, I don't know. And that's a lot of perfume, and that's very extravagant, very expensive. And the perfume is made out of something called nard, which comes from a plant that grows in the Himalayan regions of India and China, which is very, very far away from Judea. So it has to be imported. And this is the ancient world, so travel and trade from far away is hard and expensive. So nard, it's an expensive luxury item. So why does Mary do this? Why pour a pound? I mean, that's a pound of perfume. Can you imagine that? On Jesus' feet, in the middle of a dinner party. Well, nard is used in burial rituals. In the Jewish custom, a dead body was entombed within 24 hours. But decomposition starts immediately after death, so covering up the horrible smell was important. And a dead body was first washed and then covered with perfume. So this is a sign of honor, respect, love, and reverence. I mean, it's not really that different than what we do today. When someone you love dies, we don't just dispose of their lifeless corpse like random meat. We treat the body with care and respect. I suppose there's technically no reason why you can't just dump the body in an inexpensive plywood box and toss it in the ground in any ugly random place that's cheap. We pick an attractive coffin that we think the deceased might have even liked, even if it costs more money. We buy a lot of flowers, which cost money. Not necessary, but we do. We commission a nice memorial stone. We find a cemetery in a pretty and peaceful place, under a tree, green grass overlooking a river or a garden. Now, none of this is really necessary at all, but it's how we honor the dead. We treat the deceased remains with dignity, and we are inclined to do more than the bare minimum. We go above and beyond what is merely necessary. But back to the gospel. The pouring of the extravagantly expensive nard on the feet of Jesus it's evocative of the Jewish burial ritual. She's preparing the body of Jesus for burial. She's anticipating the death of Jesus. It's as though through her actions, she's publicly declaring the following, not with words, but with her actions. "I know you're going to die, and when you die, I will prepare your body for burial. I'm going to properly honor your body according to our customs, and I'm going to be extravagant because you are that important to me. I love you that much. You're not dead yet, but I want to respect and acknowledge what's going to happen because I know you're going to die." And by the way, her timing wasn't far off. She was early, but not that early, because 7 days later, Jesus would be crucified. But let me point out the obvious. She's tending to his body as if he's already dead. But he's not dead yet. This whole thing is weird and strange. And Judas protests, saying this is a stupid waste of money. And I think if we were at that dinner party, we would respond like Judas. Even if we didn't have corrupt motives about money, we would be like Judas. I think we would say, "What? What are you doing?" Because, again, Mary is acting really, really weird. This whole thing is weird. It makes no sense. Imagine we're having a dinner party at my home. Okay, I invite about 15 of you to my house for a nice, normal dinner party at my house. And then in the middle of the dinner party, in the middle of dessert, a man suddenly shows up in a black suit. And then this man just walks in beside me and takes out a tape measure and starts measuring me, my shoulders, my height, my length, my legs, my feet, while I'm eating. And then you ask, "What are you doing?" And the man in the black suit says, "I'm going to make sure Mike gets a coffin that fits him. I need to know how much embalming fluid I'm going to need to pump into his body next week." No, because embalming fluid is really expensive. I want to lock in the price and get it in bulk. In the middle of my dinner in my home, and you understandably would say, "What? Are you nuts? Get out of here." But then I say, no, let him proceed, for this mortician is doing the right thing. And that's how weird this is. It's just like that. So, okay, I'd like to make an observation about this peculiar thing that Mary did through her actions. Mary saying that she knows Jesus is going to die soon. Except for Mary, no one else seems to be aware that Jesus is going to die imminently. Now, this is really odd. His followers and his disciples have given their lives over to Jesus, yet no one seems to be thinking about his death or is terribly concerned about it, except for Mary. So this is my speculation. Mary is looking around at all the disciples, and she's thinking to herself, "You disciples, you are dense, obtuse, and oblivious. Don't you know what's going to happen?" And I wonder, I'm just speculating, maybe the reason why Mary performed this really dramatic, extravagant death ritual in public in the middle of dinner was to get their attention, to shake them up. It's her way of saying, "Wake up, pay attention. Jesus is going to die. Don't you know what's going to happen? Pay attention to the gravity of the situation." But even after the business with a nard, after this dramatic, expensive thing that she did, the disciples, the rest of the people at the table, they still don't get it. It just went over their heads. Let me back up a bit. Why did Mary think that Jesus was going to die? How did she know this? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Jesus had been telling his followers that he's going to die. In fact, he's been saying this a lot. Throughout the Gospel of John, before this dinner, Jesus has been implying, suggesting, and hinting at his fate, which is suffering, death, and resurrection. For example, in the 10th chapter of John, Jesus says, quote, "I am the shepherd," end quote. He then says, quote, "The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." And if that's too subtle, Jesus immediately follows up by saying, "I lay down my life, that I may take it up again." He then says, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord." Jesus is announcing his upcoming death. And he's telling his followers the nature of his death. First, it's voluntary. He's not a powerless victim. He's choosing to accept death. Second, his death serves a clear purpose. It's not just a random and meaningless thing that happened. The shepherd sacrifices his life to save the sheep. And likewise, Jesus says he will die to save his sheep, which are his people. And third, there's a resurrection. He says, "I laid down my life that I may take it up again." Boom. There it is. He said it clearly just a few chapters earlier. In many other places in the Gospel of John, Jesus uses the language of lifting up. Jesus says, as Moses lifted up the serpent of the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. And he says, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he. This might not be terribly clear to us, but in this context, lifting up can have two meanings. It can mean celebrated, like you win an award, so they put you on a stage, lift you up in a high place, they elevate you, and give you a medal. That's one meaning of lifting up. But lifting up can also mean being raised on a cross, being lifted, having your body lifted up high in elevation on a cross, so you're seeing him. In that language, in that culture, people would have understood the double meaning of the word lifted up. It meant crucifixion. When predicting his impending death, Jesus actually meant both. He was both crucified and glorified, which I think theologically is really cool, the way that language is used. In the Gospel of John, Jesus' predictions of his death are perhaps metaphorical, veiled, not really though. In the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' predictions about his death are much more explicit. Let me just give you one example. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus tells his disciples that he will, quote, I'm quoting here, suffer many things, be killed, and on the third day be raised. Well, that's pretty clear and on the nose. Not much room for misinterpretation and ambiguity. There's not much room for the disciples to say, Jesus is so cryptic sometimes. What's he trying to tell us? I just don't get it. What's he saying? He says things like this really, really clearly throughout the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So before this whole nard perfume episode, Jesus has been teaching his disciples that he's going to die. However, what's interesting is that no one understood what Jesus was talking about, or they didn't comprehend it, or they just couldn't, or they wouldn't, or they didn't believe him. They didn't take it seriously, except for Mary. And that's what makes a story about Mary and the perfume on Jesus' feet so odd, interesting, surprising, unexpected, unusual, and just kind of mysterious. She's the only one who understands or takes it seriously that Jesus is going to die. She seems like the only one who really gets it. And this is really shocking because the death, suffering, and resurrection of Jesus is the most important part of his work and mission. The Sermon on the Mount is amazing. The ethics of Jesus has reshaped the world. The entire globe has been reshaped by the Sermon on the Mount. The miracles, the healing of the lame, giving sight to the blind, the resurrection of Lazarus. All these are amazing things. I'm not playing them down at all. This is all incredibly important and meaningful. But without the death, suffering, and resurrection of Jesus, none of those things really, really matter. They pale in comparison. Good Friday, the day he's crucified. The Saturday, when he's dead in the grave. And Easter Sunday. Those 3 days, they're the fulcrum God uses to move the universe. Those 3 days, they're the hinge upon which the entire cosmos turns and pivots. Everything, every aspect of reality changes because of those 3 days, his death and his resurrection. And Jesus has not been subtle about it. He's not hiding it. He's been saying it again and again and again. And he's been teaching his followers to prepare them for what's coming. And in spite of all of Jesus' efforts and his good teaching, his solid teaching, they just can't get it through their thick skulls. They can't understand. It doesn't register, except for Mary. It seems like she's the only one who really internalized and comprehended and put it in her soul to really wrestle what it means that Jesus is going to die. Now, how is it possible that no one else understood? And why her? Why Mary? Why is Mary the one that got it? And this leads us to another strange and weird, mysterious thing about this moment. By any conventional standards, by any worldly standards, But with any set of human eyes, Mary is the least likely person who should have figured it out. Let me back up a bit and give us some perspective. During Jesus' 3 years of ministry, we all know he had 12 apostles. And when I was younger, I used to be under the impression that he traveled with the 12 apostles, doing his thing, and only his 12 apostles. He personally chose and trained the famous 12. He specifically selected them and commissioned them to represent him, teach, and carry on his mission during his life and after his death and resurrection. And that's all true. But he also had a much larger group of followers during his ministry beyond the 12. These were many, many committed learners and supporters who are mostly anonymous. We know a few names, but there's many more who have no names. He traveled with a much larger crowd than the 12. So I want us to think of a series of concentric circles with Jesus in the middle. The widest circle are the general followers. Again, the committed learners and followers of Jesus and his teachings, supporters. And then we have this inner circle, the 12 apostles. Jesus knows his time on earth is short, so his goal is to build a church that will thrive and grow after his death and resurrection. He's teaching and training those guys, the 12, so that they're the foundation, the leaders of what will be his new church. They are the elite. So he's got his general followers, the broadest circle. Then he's got his inner circle, the 12, the future leaders of the church. However, there's actually an inner circle in the inner circle. Among the 12, there's a group that I'm going to call the super special 3. Peter, James, and John. There are a few very important moments when Jesus pulls these 3 and separates them from the other 12. He separates from the group. There's this thing called the Transfiguration. Jesus took Peter, James, and John to a high mountain away from everyone else, and then something amazing happened. His face shone like the sun, and his garments became dazzling white. Then Moses and Elijah appeared beside him. And then God declared, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Later on, in the Garden of Gethsemane, you know this story quite well, I'd imagine. Jesus knew his death was in a few hours away, and so he was deeply troubled and grieved. So he wanted to go pray, but he didn't want to be alone. So he asked his closest friends to keep watch and stay up with him. And guess who they were? That's right, Peter, James, and John. And among these 3, there is one person who is most central. Well, Peter, of course. Later on, Jesus says Peter is a rock upon which he will build a church. He's a leader, first among equal. So we got the broadest circle, the 12, the 3, and Peter in the middle. Jesus taught lots of people. That was his mission. But it's logical that he'll pour most of his teaching and attention into the 12, and then his most intense discipleship into the 3, and then his most focused mentoring into Peter. It's not about being fair. He's not playing favorites. It's not about who has more dignity or worth. Jesus is just being practical. And yet all these guys were oblivious to Jesus' teaching about his own death, except for Mary. I find this to be a very strange mystery, so weird and odd. Why? How could this be? Well, actually, Jesus gives us the answer. In the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, there's this really famous scene where Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" Then Peter says boldly and clearly, "You are the Messiah, Son of the living God." Wow. 100 points for Peter. He's a good student. He's been paying attention and learning. All that teaching of Jesus is paying off. And so in response, Jesus declares that Peter is a rock upon which he will build his church. And then right after that, no segue, no transition, Jesus says he will go to Jerusalem, suffer and be killed, be raised to life. And then Peter rebukes Jesus and says, "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." And then in reply, Jesus says a famous words to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but the things of man." There it is. Jesus says it clear as day. He has to die. And his death is not at odds with his identity as Messiah, but deeply rooted and essential to his identity and role as Messiah. I am the Messiah, I must die. They fit together. But Peter just doesn't understand. He got the Messiah part right, which is a big deal. He just couldn't understand the death part. Again, I ask the question, how could this be? How could Peter be so right and so wrong at the same time? How could Peter be so right about knowing that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, and in the next breath be so spectacularly wrong about Jesus having to die and completely misunderstanding what's going on? He misses a boat. In Jesus' rebuke, we see the key to why Peter in particular, and all the disciples in general, misunderstood Jesus or refused to hear what he was saying about his death. As Jesus put it, Peter's mind is focused on the things of man and not the things of God. That's why he could not see it. He could see the Messiah part, but not the death part. It actually makes a lot of sense the more you think about it. Peter and his disciples were following Jesus because they believed he was the Messiah. And in this time, many Jews, including his own disciples, understood the Messiah through the lens of ancient Jewish prophecy and national hope. The Messiah was expected to be a descendant of David, which Jesus was. He was going to be, in their minds, a king who would restore the glory and power of Israel, a warrior king who would defeat Israel's enemies and reestablish God's kingdom on earth. Think of their hopes and expectations for the Messiah to be a Jewish version of King Arthur, or better yet, a Jewish Aragorn from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Messiah would literally be the return of their king, their Jewish king. Restore all things, make all things right. Noble, strong, courageous, godly, faithful. He will make all things right and put all things in order. Because right now, their world is a mess. Israel's was reduced to a vassal state. They were under the rule of a Roman Empire. And it's not just national humiliation. They were spiritually corrupted and compromised. So when they think that Jesus is a Messiah, they were expecting a political, a military leader who would lead them to independence, to defeat the Romans, and restore the spiritual soul of the Jews. After all, Jesus kept saying over and over again, the kingdom of God is at hand. The kingdom of God is at hand. That was so central to his message. And if you keep hearing that over and over again, then you realize you're not stupid for coming to the conclusion that he would be a king in a typical sense, that he was the return of the king, the second David 2.0, but even better. And if they did believe that Jesus was going to establish the new kingdom, and he would be their new king, the new David, then it's reasonable to conclude that the 12 would have high ranking and prestigious positions in the new world order. Makes sense. The king needs a royal court. Why not them? If not them, then who would it be? I mean, why would he spend all his time pouring his teaching and attention and mentoring into the 12 if they weren't going to be his royal court in a very literal earthly kingdom? Of course it was going to be them. In fact, we know this because the disciples are frequently bickering amongst themselves about who would be the greatest in the new kingdom. In the Gospel of Mark, James and John, in the Gospel of Mark, James and John approached Jesus and asked the following: grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Translation: After you become king of Israel, make one of us a prime minister, and the other one your secretary of state. One will be the second in command, and the other will be the third most important and powerful person in your kingdom. And the rest of the 10 disciples, they can have whatever jobs left over. I'm sure they'll have good jobs, but not the best jobs. That's for me and my brother. The disciples seem to think that Jesus' ministry is a 3-year job interview. And among other things, and they're doing good things for sure, but they're all jockeying for the best positions. They're trying to figure out where they are in Jesus' pecking order. Who does Jesus love most? Who's the most competent? Who's got the best leadership skills? Who's going to get the best job amongst us 12? The highest rank, the highest salary, the biggest office in the palace, the corner office with the best view. I'm not saying they were awful people or they had with terrible ulterior motives. But like all people were mixed, and clearly power, prestige, and rank was on their minds. So when Jesus tells Peter, your mind is on the things of man or things of this world and not on the things of God, Jesus is, of course, being very insightful into the inner psychology and heart of Peter. When Peter says, you are the Messiah, what he has in mind is this image of the second King David, an earthly monarch, and the glory of the restored kingdom. It's what he's expecting. It's what he wants Jesus to be. It's what he needs Jesus to be. And it's also his own self-interest for Jesus to be the second King David. After all, Jesus declared him the winner of the disciple contest. He's a rock upon which he will build a new kingdom, church. The second in command. Peter's seeing and hearing what he needs or wants to see and hear. But when Jesus follows up with, I'm going to die, it short-circuits Peter's brain. It doesn't compute. If Jesus dies, it violates and disrupts Peter's paradigm. All his plans are going to crumble. You're not supposed to die. I got plans for you. I got plans for me. Because Peter is thinking about the things of the world or the things of man. He's thinking about power, rank, reputation, and prestige, and crushing the Romans. And if Jesus dies, Peter's plans just can't work out. And that's why Jesus says Peter's eyes are so focused on earthly matters. And thus, he is blind to the obvious spiritual reality that is literally right in front of his face. Jesus has been saying it over and over again in so many different ways. And Peter just can't get it. And it's not just Peter. It's not fair to single him out. None of the disciples could hear it. They didn't understand. So here's a lesson in a nutshell. It's what Jesus told Peter. If your mind is on earthly things, you cannot see spiritual reality, even when it's right in front of your face. Even when Jesus says it in simple terms, I am going to die. You just don't hear it. And pride, ambition, status, trying to figure out where you are and trying to get higher up on the leaderboard, the hierarchy table. They are not wrong in themselves clearly. Ambition, pride, accomplishments, these are not inherently wrong. Having rank and title is not a sin in itself. For a lot of us, would be in a lot of trouble. But if you're too focused on those things, they can and they will blind us to the things of God and the spiritual reality that's always there. And here's another thing that's really striking, by the way. I just noticed this the past month when reading this. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in those Gospels, each time Jesus predicts his death in plain terms, the disciples immediately argue about who will be the greatest in the kingdom, who gets the best seats in the house. Immediately, no segue, no in-between verse. I'm going to die, let's fight about who's going to win. The more Jesus talks about suffering and dying, the more they talk about status and power. It's the weirdest thing. Narratively, it makes no sense, but it's there. So let's go back to the original question, the original mystery that seems so odd and peculiar. The 12 could not understand that Jesus was going to die. His inner circle, the famous three, the super special three, Peter, James, and John, could not see it. And of course, Peter, epic fail. He really didn't see it. So why Mary? At least two reasons come to mind. First, Mary just listens. There's that well-known story about Mary and Martha, the 10th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. Martha was irritated because she was trying to host, while Mary sat at the feet of Jesus, doing what? Listening to what he had to say. And Mary wasn't helping. So Martha complains to Jesus. And Jesus says these amazingly famous words, Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. We really don't know much about Mary. She doesn't show up that much in the Bible. But what we do know from the few bits of verses that we have about her is that she prioritized listening to Jesus, and the posture is very revealing. She's humbly sitting at his feet. And Jesus appreciated what Mary was doing. He noticed and took special care to teach her. What did Jesus teach Mary while she was sitting at his feet? The Bible doesn't say. Here's my guess. I think it was telling her about his death and resurrection. And Mary listened and learned and took it all in. I think it was also because Mary was in the outermost circle and on the outside. She was on the periphery. And by any external standards, Mary was not important, and she was a woman. And this is a patriarchal society. So while the disciples were elbowing and jostling for position, trying to get Jesus' attention in the next administration, her place, Mary's place in the hierarchy, wasn't even on her radar. A position of prestige was never an option for her. This was never a job interview. Her mind was clearly on the very things that blinded Peter and the others. They thought of earthly things. Thus, her mind was on godly things. She just wanted to learn. She wasn't distracted. Therefore, Mary could see, hear, and learn with clarity. Oftentimes, those in the humblest positions, those on the margins, the people that the world ignores and passes over as unimportant, people who appear to be trivial and anonymous, oftentimes they're the ones who can see the truth that the powerful, the attractive, the beautiful, the successful ones just can't see. Or you're so fixated on power, rank, and title, credit, recognition, they become blinders. You can't or won't see the truth of God that's right in front of you. Those on the outer margins, the bottom of the rung of society, who have no hope of advancing up higher, they might be closer to God. They're not blinded or distracted. They see the truth more clearly because they're humble. They're at Jesus' feet. They're low. And when you're low, you can listen. When they're outside, then you can see in. This view from below isn't unique to Mary. It's a recurring pattern in John's gospel. Consider Nicodemus, who had everything going for him and just struggled to see. He, of all people, should have known the truth, but he couldn't see it. At least not at first. Nicodemus, as you know, he's a Pharisee, but not just a Pharisee. He's a super Pharisee. He is a ruler of the Jews, a member of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was like the supreme religious and judicial council of the Jewish people. It was a final authority on religious and civil and criminal matters affecting all Jews. The Sanhedrin could interpret Jewish law, adjudicate disputes, and issue binding decrees. It was basically the equivalent of our Supreme Court, but add religion and theology while you're at it. And there's evidence that strongly suggests that Nicodemus was really, really wealthy. So Nicodemus is about as elite as one could be in that world, as prestigious, as intelligent, as praised as you could possibly be in that world. Now, he heard Jesus preach. He knew about the miracles. And he could have just dismissed Jesus like all the other Pharisees. But he didn't. He was intrigued. And so you know the famous story, don't you? He requests a private meeting with Jesus at night. And that's a very important detail. He was interested. He must have thought Jesus was preaching some kind of truth. There's something about this guy that's, he's on to something, and I'm intrigued. And he wanted to learn more from Jesus. But it had to be a secret. He had to go at night and sneak in under the cover of darkness. No one could ever find out they had a conversation. Why? Because Nicodemus had to protect his reputation, his status, his authority. It was too risky. Nicodemus had too much to lose. If anyone found out that Nicodemus was talking to Jesus, his reputation's shot. He might get kicked off the Sanhedrin. He might lose his job, his status, his prestige, maybe his money. And their dialogue is also really revealing. And remember what Jesus said, no one can see the kingdom unless they're born again. Now, we can spend a ton of time digging into John chapter 3 where all this is recorded. But we're not going to do that in the interest of time. At least some of what Jesus is saying here is that to see the kingdom of God, you have to be humble, like a baby. You need to quit assuming you comprehend everything and control everything like an adult. You need to give up and abandon your assumptions about your own competency and your own mastery of the world. You want to follow me and see me, you got to start over. Be a baby. Give up all the stuff you've accumulated and be humble. And be a baby. Start over. Then you can learn. And that has to be incredibly hard for a guy like Nicodemus because he has so much to lose. He's so high up on the leaderboard, the fall to the bottom is enormous. He's so talented. He's had the best education of his age. He's the greatest theologian of his generation. He has dedicated his entire life studying the things of God. And there he is, offered the greatest gift a person like him, or the greatest gift any person could ever get, a one-on-one meeting with God. And he couldn't recognize what was right in front of him. This man spends his whole life studying God, and he doesn't recognize a God right in front of his face. It's so sad. And Jesus gets frustrated with Nicodemus. His words, "Are you the teacher of Israel, and you do not understand these things?" And the answer is no. Nicodemus could not see. He had the best education in the world, the greatest theologian, and he couldn't see the truth. Why? Because he was too proud to see. He was so proud he couldn't even confront Jesus in daylight, had to sneak in the back door in the middle of the night. And by the way, the story of Nicodemus does have a happy ending. In the 7th chapter of John, where the Sanhedrin attempt to have Jesus arrested, Nicodemus risked his reputation by defending Jesus, and he was mocked by his peers. And after the crucifixion, Nicodemus joins Joseph of Arimathea to honor Jesus' body. And he brings 75 pounds of aloe and myrrh. This was public veneration and devotion. Think about this startling reversal. 7 days before, Mary, anonymous, marginal, a woman with no claim to status, pours out her pound of nard on Jesus' living feet, preparing him for a burial while he still breathes. 7 days later, the mighty Nicodemus, the one who came by night, the elite theologian with everything to lose, myrrh and aloe to anoint Jesus' cold, lifeless body. And Mary beat Nicodemus by 7 days. But notice the one without position saw the cross coming first. The one with every advantage arrived later. He was a late follower of Jesus. But when Nicodemus does, he came with humility and reverence, bearing a king's ransom. Paul's another example of someone who should have seen the truth but could not, at least not initially. Paul was likely the most naturally intelligent and the most educated author in the New Testament. And despite his sharp theological mind and his refined rabbinic education, he could not see the truth while it was again staring him in the face. I think in part it's because his intelligence and education made him arrogant and proud. Didn't help him see his theological knowledge, as his natural intelligence, his high IQ. It didn't help him see the truth. I mean, ironically, it did the opposite. It blinded him from the truth. He had everything but humility, and that blinded him. That until, actually, God literally blinded him on the road to Damascus. After his sight was taken away, he was reduced, helpless, powerless, humbled. Here's some poetic irony. Only after he was blinded could he see. And the truth came to him, not because he used his powerful intellect, armed with the best theological education of the day, but because God, in his mercy, revealed it to him. They sort of pumped it into him from the outside. He couldn't take credit for it. Paul couldn't take credit for it. Only God could take credit for what he did. And then Paul's eyes were opened, and he could see. And when he could see physically, he could also see theologically. He could see the truth of God. You might think the lesson from the sermon is that any kind of power and position or education is bad. That if you have some sort of rank or status, you need to quit your job and take on a humble entry-level position. Or you need to never go to college or school, lest your knowledge make you arrogant and blind. No. That's a simplistic misunderstanding of what I'm trying to say, what the Bible's trying to say. The 12 disciples did not renounce their positions. They came eventually to understand the truth, eventually, and they served and built the church in their positions of authority. Peter did not abdicate his position as leader, the rock. He served in that position his whole life. Paul did not give himself a lobotomy. He would use his mind and education to build the theological foundations of the New Testament. And Paul was uniquely equipped to present the Jewish faith in a way that resonated with the Hellenistic world. So it's not about power or knowledge. The problem is the craving for those things and what pride might lead to. Many of us in this room have climbed quite high, and a lot of you aren't done yet. And what the Bible tells us is, on your way up, be cautious, because as you get higher, the height might blind you. God is not anti-ambition. He's not anti-excellence. However, the kind of ambition and greatness God calls us to, and he does call us to greatness. He does want us to be ambitious, but it's going to look very different than what the world has. God's definition of greatness is likely very different than your definition of greatness. God's holy ends for your life might look very different than what you think are the ends of your life. Humility is a prerequisite for seeing the truth. Paul, Nicodemus, disciples, and for Mary. Ultimately, not only did Jesus have to die, but to follow Jesus means we have to be willing to die. By tradition, except for John, all the disciples were martyred. The ambitious disciples who once squabbled over who got the corner office eventually did learn their lesson. You are not necessarily called to be crucified upside down like Peter, but to follow Jesus, you're called to put to death your ego, your pride, and your own sense of what you want to do with your life. And if we are humbled, then maybe we'll see the truth of God. Let us pray. Lord, we are overwhelmed by the truth, and we confess we often don't see it.